It's not an easy position, the one of the central bank, because on the one hand you have a very high inflation, and on the other hand you have a very sharp contraction of domestic demand.
So when taking a look at the Latin American country of Brazil and their economic situation, it's probably a good question to start with is why? Why is there such a deep financial crisis at present?
Brazil is facing a lot of problems, and on the one hand, the country is being hit by the moderation of the Chinese economy, and by the moderation of commodity prices. More related to local issues, we also see a lot of problems, and the main ones are the fact that in the last years the country didn't take the steps to increase its productivity. Right, the productivity has been practically stopped in the last years, right? And then on top of that, we can say that there were some mistakes in terms of macroeconomic policy. And I'd like to say, for example, in this sense that monetary policy was too tolerant with respect to inflation, and especially fiscal policy was too expensive. Right, the government just spent a lot in the last years, especially after the Lehman Brothers crisis. And if you put all these things together, the external factors and the internal factors, you have a crisis, and that's what we are seeing today in Brazil.
Absolutely, and you lightly touched on the fiscal policies there. So why were the fiscal policies, why were they such an issue?
As I was saying, the Brazilian government just spent too much in the last years. Right, and as a consequence of that, we see that Brazil's debt, the public sector debt, increased from 52% of GDP in 2013 to probably 72% by the end of this year. Right, then you have a very sharp increase in the public debt. That's generating a lot of concerns, and if you want to be more precise about what's behind this deterioration in fiscal accounts, this increase in the public sector debt, we could say that there is a cyclical problem, and the cyclical problem is that with the deceleration, revenues are falling. Right, but the two most important problems here are structural, and they are one, the fact that expenditure in Brazil is too rigid. Expenses in Brazil, public expenses are very inflexible. The government cannot cut them during times when these kind of measures are needed. Right, then you need to change this. Since this is a feature that is due to the Brazilian Constitution, you should discuss about changing the Constitution. It's not something easy, right? But it's something that the Brazilian society has to discuss at this point. On top of that, also on the expenditure side, we have seen a very sharp increase in the social security deficit. The Brazilian population is getting old. Brazil is not a young country anymore, and as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of the fact that the social security system in Brazil is relatively generous, we have been seeing this very sharp increase in the social security deficit, as I said.
So you've mentioned fiscal policies there. We've got inflation, which is very high in Brazil at the moment. So what is the actual monetary policy reaction to this? How are they dealing with the situation?
As you said, inflation is still very high. Even though domestic demand is contracting, inflation is around 9% at this moment. Is much higher than the inflation target, that is 4.5%. And why is that? Why is inflation so high even though domestic demand is very weak? Basically because we have the government has been aligning the prices of regulated products and services. Right, they were too low, artificially low during the past years, and they now they are being corrected, and that is a source of pressures in terms of inflation. Because you have Brazil faced a very sharp depreciation of the exchange rate, that's also generating pressures on inflation. Right. Then, given that you have such a high inflation, the central bank of Brazil in the last year, in the beginning of this year, it has adjusted upwards the policy rate, the Selic rate, and and it reached the 14.25%. And in the last months, the central bank has been keeping the policy rate at such high level. Right, it's not an easy position, the one of the central bank, because on the one hand you have a very high inflation, and on the other hand you have a very sharp contraction of domestic demand. Right, but at this point the central bank is being conservative. And that means that it has been keeping the Selic at 14.25%. And in my view, they will continue. They will continue to do so. And only at the beginning of the next year, when inflation starts to ease more sharply, is going to be when the Selic rate will be cut.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming in today and giving us your overview on Brazil's economy.
You're welcome.
That's all from us here in the Geneva studios, but if you did like this interview, do like and comment on dukascopy.tv.